I never thought I'd hear my wife call me worthless in front of a courtroom full of strangers. I sat there in a gray suit that felt too tight in the shoulders, staring at my own hands, while Linda stood at the podium and asked for the house, the savings, and everything he doesn't deserve. The air in that room had the dry, stale smell of old paper and bad coffee, and I could feel every eye sliding toward me like I was already half a man. It was a Tuesday morning in Franklin County Divorce Court in Columbus, and I had already spent enough months dreading this day that I'd started sleeping in fragments. I used to wake up before dawn out of habit, make coffee, and listen to the furnace hum in the quiet of our split-level house on the cul-de-sac. That house had held 32 years of birthdays, church potlucks, and one son learning to ride a bike in the driveway. I had thought a life built that slowly could not come apart so fast, but retirement changed me in ways I didn't know how to name. The nights got heavy. The grocery store felt too bright. A crowded aisle at Walmart could leave my palms damp and my thoughts scattered. I hated that part most, because I had spent my whole adult life wearing discipline like a second skin, and suddenly I couldn't explain why I'd go still when a cart rattled too close behind me. Linda noticed, of course. She noticed everything once it stopped being useful to her. In the beginning, she would set a mug of coffee near my chair and ask if I wanted to sit on the porch for a while. Then the questions turned sharper, like she was trying to pry open a lock with her fingernails. At dinner, she stopped looking at me across the table and started looking through me as if I had become another piece of furniture she was already tired of dusting. So when she said it out loud, I felt it in my chest before I fully understood it. Worthless, marine, everything he doesn't deserve. I kept my face still, because that's what I'd been trained to do, but inside, I felt something in me folding, small, 1 inch at a time. Then Judge Morgan leaned forward, frowned at the file, and said my name, like he had just stepped on a memory. "Harlan," he asked, and the whole room went quiet. Why would that name stop him cold? If you had seen us, then you would have called us solid. That was the lie of it, I think. Not a cruel lie, just the kind people tell themselves when the porch light is on, the lawn is cut, and there's a casserole cooling on the counter from church. Linda used to laugh with the ladies at potluck like she belonged in the center of every room she walked into. I drove our old Honda through suburban Columbus with our son Michael asleep in the back seat after Sunday dinner, and I believed we had built something that could outlast weather money worries and everything else life liked to throw at you. I believed that because I wanted to. We all do when the house is full and the future still feels wide open. For a long time, that was enough. I fixed things around the house, Linda kept the place warm, and Michael grew up knowing he would always have a plate set for him. There were years when the biggest problem we had was whether we were bringing mac and cheese or a pie to the church fellowship. I still remember Linda at the sink, sleeves rolled up humming while she rinsed dishes. It felt ordinary in the best way. Ordinary is supposed to be boring, but when your life is steady, ordinary feels like a blessing. You don't want to name too loudly. Then I retired, and something in me came home wrong. I didn't have the words for it. That was the part I hated most. I had spent years in places where you learned to keep moving no matter what was happening inside you, and when the noise finally stopped, it all came back at once. I'd wake up before dawn with my shirt damp and my heart racing like it was trying to outrun a memory I couldn't see clearly enough to name. At the grocery store, the crowd around the meat aisle could make my skin go tight and my hands clumsy. I'd stand there staring at cereal boxes like I'd forgotten why I came in. Linda would ask, "You okay?" And I'd say, "Just tired." Tired was safe. Tired didn't make anyone look at me too closely, but the shame sat with me anyway. I could feel it at the diner, at the credit union, even in church when someone squeezed my shoulder too hard and asked how retirement was treating me. I wanted to say the truth. I wanted to say I felt like part of me had been left somewhere I couldn't go back and get. Instead, I smiled, nodded, and kept my coffee moving in slow circles. Men like me are good at pretending the room isn't closing in. Linda noticed more than I thought she did. At first she brought me coffee without asking and left the television low when I was in the recliner after supper. Then she started watching me like she was waiting for something inconvenient to happen. I'd catch her standing in the doorway, arms folded, her face already tired, before I'd said a word. The space between us didn't break all at once. It thinned quietly, like winter air sneaking through a cracked window. And one evening, while I was staring at nothing in the kitchen, she sighed and said, "You're not really here anymore, are you?" That was the first time I felt her begin to step back from me. What I didn't know then was how far she would let that distance grow. The first time Linda compared our life to the women in her book club, she did it with a smile so polished I almost missed the cut in it. We were standing in the kitchen in suburban Columbus, and she was stirring coffee, like she was trying to keep herself steady. She said one of the ladies had just finished a trip to Charleston, and another was talking about a condo near Hilton Head, and then she looked at me like I was the weather she had to endure. "They're all still doing something," she said. "They're not just sitting around on a fixed income." That sentence lodged in me like a pebble in a shoe. Small, harmless-looking, impossible to ignore once it started rubbing. I laughed it off because that's what I'd always done, but I felt my face go hot anyway. After that, her words got sharper in ways that made me second-guess myself. The grocery budget became a lecture. The electric bill became a disappointment. If I bought anything without asking, even something cheap from Walmart, she'd set it on the counter and let the silence do the work. I could hear what she wasn't saying, that I had become a man, with less to offer, less to spend less, to prove I still mattered. And what hurt most was that Linda was trying so hard to look above it all, like aging was something that only happened to other women, the ones who let themselves go. She started talking more about appearances, about keeping up, about not looking stuck. The more she said it, the more I realized she wasn't really talking about money. She was talking about fear. I saw it in little flashes. The way she checked her reflection before church and frowned at nothing. The way she lingered over catalogs she couldn't afford, then snapped if I asked a simple question. The way she kept bringing up the women at book club as if their lives were a window she could tap on with her fingernail and ask to be let in. I don't think she knew how exposed she sounded. People like to think contempt comes from strength, but sometimes it's just panic wearing better clothes. I'd sit at the kitchen table after she went to bed and listen to the refrigerator hum, feeling more like a guest in my own house than a husband. That was when I started keeping receipts. Not because I wanted a war. Because I'd learned the hard way that memory gets muddy when someone starts rewriting the past in real time. I tucked away the utility bills, the pension statements, the Social Security notices, every retirement paper I could find. I made copies and kept them in a folder at the bottom of the desk drawer right under the old holiday cards. It felt ridiculous, almost embarrassing, but it also felt like breathing through a cracked window. If the air changed again, I wanted proof of what had been there before. And when Linda looked at that folder one night and asked too casually what I was hiding, I knew the distance between us had turned into something colder. Linda said it on a Tuesday night, standing in the kitchen with her purse still on her shoulder like she was about to leave for the store. "I want a divorce," she said, flat and neat, the way someone might say they were out of milk. I remember staring at the counter where she'd left a half-made cup of tea, and all I could think was that 32 years had just been reduced to a sentence shorter than the weather report. I asked her if she was serious, not because I didn't hear her, but because some part of me still believed a life that long deserved a little mercy. She didn't even look ashamed. She just sighed like I was making her late. I felt the room tilt quietly, the way it does when you step off a curb you didn't see. I didn't beg. I didn't raise my voice. I'd already spent too many nights trying to fix things that kept breaking in the same places, and I was tired in a way sleep couldn't touch. She said she wanted the house, and I said fine. She said the furniture was hers in spirit, and I let that go too. By the time she started talking about the savings, I could hear my own pulse in my ears. But I still told her I didn't want a war. That was the truth. I wanted the pain to stop, even if it meant handing over more than I should have. People love to say love makes you generous, but exhaustion can make you surrender pieces of yourself you didn't even know were negotiable. So I signed where I was told to sign. I moved my clothes into a spare room, then into a box, and then into a cheap apartment south of town, where the carpet smelled like old smoke and fresh paint was just a promise. Linda kept the house. The sectional, the dining room table, the Christmas dishes, all the little things that made the place look lived in. I let her have more than she asked for, because I thought maybe if I made it easy, the humiliation would stay small. That was my mistake. Once someone learns you'll fold instead of fight, they start mistaking your silence for weakness. I was too drained to see the trap, but not too drained to feel the cold of it. In court, her lawyer leaned into that softness like it was a crack in the wall. He talked about my episodes, my unreliability, the way I withdrew from family life, as if I'd chosen to become a ghost in my own home. I sat there with my hands clasped so tight my knuckles went pale, and I let him keep going, because I didn't yet know that some lies only grow teeth when nobody challenges them. Linda didn't look at me once. She just sat there with her chin lifted, and her lawyer said I was unstable and useless. Then he said it again like repetition could make it true. The room felt smaller when the judge looked at me again, like the air itself had turned tight and unforgiving. I could still feel the heat in my face from Linda's lawyer treating me like a cautionary tale, like I was some broken thing that had wandered in from the wrong side of life. I kept my eyes down for a second, because embarrassment has a way of making a grown man feel 13 years old. Well, then I heard it in Judge Morgan's voice. That slight change people miss if they're not listening for it. Staff Sergeant Hayes. My stomach dropped so hard I thought I might have misheard him. I looked up and saw his expression shift, not warm exactly, but sharp with recognition, as if a memory had just stepped out from behind a curtain. Linda turned toward him confused, and for the first time all morning she stopped looking certain. I knew that look. It was the look of someone realizing the room had a back door she didn't know about. He asked me if I'd served with the 3rd Marine Division. His tone changed when I said yes, just a little, but enough. The silence after that felt loaded, like everyone in the room had inhaled and forgotten how to let it out. Linda's lawyer tried to keep talking, but even he sounded unsure, and that was new. People like him usually live on momentum. Take that away and they start to wobble. I didn't want attention. I wanted the floor to open and swallow me whole, because being recognized felt almost worse than being insulted. It meant I had been seen, and not in the way Linda wanted the court to see me. I could feel her staring at me now, trying to match the man sitting beside her, with whatever story she had rehearsed. I had spent too many years becoming background in my own house, and suddenly the judge was looking at me like I mattered. Judge Morgan leaned back, his face tight with something that looked like disbelief. He asked for a moment, then another. "Counsel?" "Hold on," he said, and the words landed like a dropped gavel. He told the clerk to pause the hearing. Just like that, the room stopped pretending it knew where this was going. I sat there with my hands folded, my pulse loud in my ears, and watched Linda's certainty begin to leak out around the edges. And when the judge said he needed to speak with me privately, I knew this wasn't over, not even close. Judge Morgan did not wave me in like some secret he wanted hidden. He looked straight at Linda's attorney first, then mine, and said calm as winter that he was taking a brief recess and speaking with me in chambers, with both counsel informed. That mattered to me more than I expected. I had spent years being treated like my words could be folded up and put away. And now the rules were being said out loud before anyone moved another inch. The hallway outside chambers was quieter than the courtroom, but it felt heavier, like the air had remembered everything that had happened in there. My hands were steady, though I could feel the old instinct to apologize for existing creeping up my spine. Judge Morgan opened the door himself and asked me to sit, not because he was soft, but because he was careful. There was no performance in him now, only the kind of attention that makes a man straighten without knowing why. He said my name once, then waited. I told him the truth, the way I had learned to tell hard things in the Marines plane without decoration. Years ago, after a hurricane tore through the coast near Camp Lejeune, I had been part of a rescue team when a bridge washed out and people got stranded in rising water. His younger sister had been one of them. I had pulled strangers to safety all night, including her, and I had never told a soul, because that wasn't the point. We did what needed doing and went home with wet boots and no applause. He listened without interrupting, but I could see pieces of the room changing in his face. Not pity, recognition. That was almost harder to bear. I told him I wasn't brave in the way people like to clap for. I just knew what it was to keep moving when everyone else was panicking. I knew how to carry weight that didn't belong to me and make it look easy even when it wasn't. That sounded a lot like my marriage, and I hated how true that felt. For a second, neither of us spoke. I could hear the low murmur of the attorneys outside, and I realized how thin my whole life had become to everybody who had never bothered to look past the surface. Then Judge Morgan opened a folder on his desk, and the sound of paper moving was so small it almost felt sacred. He looked at me over the top of it and said he had letter statements and something else he wanted me to see. This he said quietly as proof of the kind of man you've been. The folder felt heavier in my hands than it should have, like paper could carry a whole life if somebody cared enough to save it. I sat there in Judge Morgan's chambers, hearing the courthouse hum through the walls, and the first note I unfolded was written in a shaking hand on lined notebook paper. It was from a Marine I had never mentioned to Linda, a kid from my unit, who said I sat with him on a cot in a storm-battered shelter and talked him through the longest night of his life. He wrote that I made him feel human again. I had to set the page down and breathe through the sting behind my eyes, because I had spent so many years believing my life had shrunk to what Linda could see from the kitchen table. Apparently, there was an entire part of me she never met. The next letter was from a widow in Hilliard. Her mortgage company had given her one more deadline than she could survive on her pension, and I had paid the balance without telling anyone, not even my own son. She wrote that she had prayed for a miracle and got a quiet man who left no name behind. I remember the reason I did it. She had the same stunned look people get when they're trying not to fall apart in public, and I knew that look. I had seen it in barracks, in church foyers, in grocery store parking lots. I never thought of it as heroism. I thought of it as what decent men do when nobody is clapping. That kind of kindness is like a porch light left on in a dark neighborhood. It does more good than anyone notices. Then I found the last note in my hands actually went cold around the page. It was from a young corporal barely old enough to shave properly, who wrote that I found him alone behind the motor pool and stayed with him until dawn, because he was sure nobody would miss him if he disappeared. Morgan didn't need to tell me why he had kept that one close. The words were plain, but they hit harder than anything shouted in court. I read it twice then, a third time, because some truths land like thunder, and some land like a soft knock you can't stop hearing. I had always believed my silence was protecting other people. I was starting to understand it was also making me invisible to the one person I wanted to know me best. By the time I put the pages back in the folder, I felt the shape of my own mistake in a way I never had before. I had spent years carrying everybody else's weight so neatly that Linda assumed I had none. I kept my pain tucked away, my helping hand hidden, my dignity folded small enough to fit in a drawer. And now I could see the cost of that. I had protected strangers, but I had starved my own marriage of the truth. Linda had not just missed the man I was becoming. She had never been handed the map. And sitting there in the hush after Morgan closed the folder, I realized the worst part was this. She had been living beside my life the whole time, and she never knew what I had been trying to save. When I walked back through those courtroom doors, I felt it before I saw it. The room had changed shape. It was like stepping into my own house and realizing someone had moved the furniture while I was gone, same walls, same air, but nothing sat where it used to. Linda was still there with her chin lifted, just a little too high, but the confidence she'd been wearing like perfume had started to fade at the edges. Judge Morgan didn't say much when I returned to my seat. He didn't have to. The way he looked at me told everyone in that room that I was no longer just the man my wife had described. I saw Linda notice it too. Her eyes flicked from him to me and back again, and for the first time, I saw a question on her face, instead of that polished little smile she used when she thought she had the upper hand. It was almost worse than anger. It was uncertainty. Her lawyer cleared his throat and kept talking, like volume could still win the day. He tried to sound steady, but I could hear the strain in it now like a radio losing signal. He leaned on words like burden and failure, but they landed flatter than he expected. That's the thing about a story built on sanding somebody down until they look small. Once one person in the room refuses to believe it, the whole thing starts to wobble. I sat there with my hands folded, breathing slow, and let the silence do some of the work for me. I had spent too many years reacting too fast, apologizing too quickly, trying to make other people comfortable with my pain. Not this time. This time I was learning that stillness can be a kind of armor. Not loud, not flashy, just steady enough to let the truth find its footing. Linda kept glancing at me as if she expected me to flinch, to look away, to shrink back into the version of myself she had rewritten for everybody else. But I didn't. I just watched her realize piece by piece that the room was no longer moving to her rhythm. And the moment she understood that her lawyer asked one question too many, and Judge Morgan's expression changed again. The rain had turned the courthouse lot into one long gray mirror, and I could feel the cold in my sleeves before I even reached my truck. Linda came out behind me slower than before, her heels clicking soft on the wet concrete, like even the weather had muted itself. For a second, neither of us spoke. I think we were both listening to the same thing, that strange hollow sound of a life cracking open in public and then pretending it hadn't. She finally said my name, but it didn't sound sharp anymore. It sounded lost. Who are you really? I should have had an answer ready after all those years. A husband is supposed to know how to answer that. A man is supposed to be able to explain himself. But I had spent so long shrinking my pain down to fit inside quiet dinners and polite smiles that I didn't know where the edges of me ended anymore. I told her the truth anyway, because there was nothing left to protect. I'm the man who came home and didn't know how to talk about what followed, I said. I'm the man who kept trying to be easy to live with, because I thought that would make the hurt smaller. Her face changed in the rain, not all at once, but in little slips. The certainty she wore like makeup had started to wash away. I saw confusion first, then something softer and far more dangerous to both of us, recognition. I thought you stopped loving me, she said. That one landed harder than any of the court arguments. Not because it was cruel, but because I believed she might have been telling the truth. All that silence between us had started sounding like rejection to her and like survival to me. We had been standing in the same house for years, each of us interpreting the same quiet in opposite languages. I leaned against the truck door and let the rain do what I couldn't. I didn't stop loving you, I said. I stopped knowing how to explain why I felt so far away. For a moment she didn't answer. Then she looked at me like she was seeing an old photograph with new eyes, and I knew she was remembering things she had filed away as ordinary. The canceled doctor appointments I never complained about, the envelope of bills I left on the kitchen counter, the notes I tucked into the junk drawer because I didn't trust my voice long enough to say them out loud. I had been leaving breadcrumbs for years, and she had walked past them with her mind already made up. What hurt most was that I had understood her loneliness too late to save us from it. And when she said I found something in the attic, I knew the part she had missed was finally about to look back at her. The attic was hotter than the rest of the house, the kind of stale heat that makes every breath feel like it has to pass through old grief first. I heard Linda move the little folding ladder, then the scrape of cardboard, then that sudden silence that always means a person has found something they were never meant to see. When she called my name, it was so quiet I almost didn't answer. But I did, and by then I already knew she had opened the footlocker. I had kept that box tucked under the eaves for years, like it was a part of me I couldn't carry in daylight. My medals were in there, yes, but not for display, not for pride. They sat beside letters from men I'd helped get through bad nights, a folded note from the VA, a few pay stubs from the security job I worked after midnight, and the anniversary card I never finished. Because every time I tried, the words came out looking too small for what I felt. Love, when you're ashamed of yourself, can start to feel like a language you've forgotten. Linda came down the stairs, holding that card like it might break if she breathed on it. I watched her read the first line, then stop. Her face changed in the way a room changes, when the lights go off one by one. I could see her tracing my handwriting reading where I had started to say I was sorry for being distant, for waking up hollow, for leaving her alone with bills and silence, and a husband who kept saying he was fine when he wasn't fine at all. I had wanted to protect her from the worst of me. Instead, I had taught her to doubt the parts of me that were still trying. She asked, "You kept this all this time," and I could only nod. There was no clean answer for why a man stores his pain like old tools in a shed. Sometimes it's because he still thinks he'll need them. Sometimes it's because he doesn't know how to throw away proof that he tried. That was the first time I saw guilt in her face, without anger covering it up. And it was also the first time I understood how dangerous it had been to trust memory alone. Paper does not get tired. Dates do not twist themselves into excuses. A record can't be talked out of what it says, which is why I kept every bill, every pension statement, every note, every letter. I hadn't been collecting evidence for revenge. I had been collecting the story of my own life before someone else rewrote it for me. When Linda looked back at me, I could tell she finally saw that there was more in that box than paper, and she was about to open the next thing I had hidden from her all these years. Michael didn't say anything at first. He just stood there in the doorway, holding that old box like it weighed more than wood and metal ever should. The room felt too small for the silence between us, and I could see him doing the math in his head before he ever opened his mouth. That kind of silence is never empty. It's the sound of somebody finally seeing the whole picture and realizing it was never the picture they were sold. He took out the papers, then the pay stubs, then the title transfer for my Harley. I watched his face change one piece at a time. First confusion, then disbelief, then something sharper that made his jaw set. He looked up at me and said, "You sold the bike." I told him I had years back when the furnace went out and Linda was already cutting every corner like she was sharpening a blade. He just stared at me like he was trying to understand how a man could disappear in his own house and nobody notice until the shelves were empty. I didn't make a speech. I never was the kind of father who knew how to dress pain up in a nice sentence. I just told him I worked nights at a security desk off Alum Creek while everybody else was sleeping, and I came home smelling like stale coffee and fluorescent lights. I told him I skipped lunches, bought boots from Goodwill, and let my own needs get smaller and smaller so the mortgage, the groceries, and the property tax could stay paid. The old Harley was the easy part to see. The harder part was all the little sacrifices that never made a sound. Michael sat down slowly, like the truth had finally given out under him. I could see he was angry, but not at me. At the years, at the way love can become invisible when one person keeps caring more than they admit. He said, "Why didn't you tell me?" And I almost laughed because that question had lived in my house for so long, it felt like another piece of furniture. I told him I didn't want to be a burden. That sentence tasted bitter coming out, because I had said it so many times. I'd started believing it was the same thing as being strong. He picked up the receipts again, and I let him. That mattered to me more than I could explain. I had spent too long hoping somebody would notice without me having to ask. But proof doesn't depend on hope. It sits there plain and stubborn, waiting for somebody honest enough to read it. And when Michael finally looked at me like he understood what Linda had spent years not seeing, I knew the next thing she did was going to matter a lot more than she realized. The quiet after that conversation felt stranger than the shouting ever had. I sat at my kitchen table with a legal pad, a cup of coffee gone cold beside me, and for the first time in years, I stopped asking myself what Linda wanted and started asking what I could prove. That change mattered. Pain makes you want to react. Survival makes you get organized. The next morning, I drove to an elder law attorney's office on the west side of Columbus, the kind of place with framed certificates, polite lighting, and a receptionist who looked like she had seen every family lie in Ohio. Ms. Turner didn't rush me. She listened while I laid out the house, the pension, the checking account, the Social Security direct deposit, and the little withdrawals Linda had started making. Sound normal when they were anything but. When I finished, she said, "You did the right thing coming in now." I nearly had to swallow past the feeling in my throat, because nobody had said that to me in a long time. I went home and emptied the hallway cabinet onto the table. Bank statements, pension letters, property tax bills, the deed, insurance papers, old envelopes I should have thrown away but didn't, because something in me had always known paper could tell the truth when people wouldn't. I made copies at the credit union and kept one set in a folder, another in a locked drawer, and a third with Michael, because I was done trusting memory to protect me. Every page I sorted felt like I was putting my life back into a frame after somebody had tried to bend it. Linda noticed the folders before she noticed me. She stood in the doorway looking at the stacks like they had insulted her. "What is all this?" she asked, too bright, too casual. "Just making sure I know where everything is," I said. She gave me that thin smile she used when she wanted me to feel foolish for paying attention. But I could see the flicker under it now. She was reaching harder, talking louder, acting like confidence was the same thing as control. And people who overplay their hand usually do it because they can feel the table tilting under them. By the time she turned away, I had already seen the mistake she was about to make. The first thing I noticed was how hard Linda kept talking, like volume could cover the gap between what she wanted and what the papers actually said. Her lawyer slid a stack of copies across the table and started using words like equitable and temporary access. But I could see they were building a house on sand. The numbers on the page did not line up with the story in their mouths, and I didn't have to argue, because the truth had a quieter voice than panic. I just sat there and let them keep reaching. Linda kept insisting she should handle the accounts until the phrase started sounding strange even to her. She barely knew which checking account paid the property tax and which savings account held the emergency fund, but she still spoke like a woman taking back something stolen from her. That was the part that stung, because I could hear how badly she wanted control without having the facts to hold it. I had seen men in uniform bluff their way through danger, and I knew the sound of a shaky hand pretending to be steady. Her lawyer tried to steer the conversation toward the house, then the IRA, then the direct deposits one at a time, like he was fishing for a weak spot. I kept my face still. I had learned a long time ago that the person who talks first in a room like that usually talks too much. Every time he pressed, Linda nodded a little too fast, as if agreeing quickly would make her look informed. It didn't. It made her look rehearsed. I could feel her irritation growing when I didn't help her fill the silence. She glanced at me once sharp and tight, the way people do when they expect you to rescue their story and you refuse. I almost felt sorry for her in that moment. Almost. Because beneath all that polish, she was starting to look like someone who had built a ladder without checking whether it reached the right window. And now she was stuck halfway up, trying not to look down. Then her lawyer asked about a missing retirement record, and I saw Linda's face change before anyone else did. It was small, just a flicker, but it was enough. The room went thinner after that, like the air had been pulled tight. I leaned forward, asked for the bank inquiry number, and the answer that came back did not match what they had been saying at all. That was when I knew the first crack had opened, and I wondered how long before the whole thing started to give. The first thing I felt was relief, and that surprised me. Not joy, not triumph, just the clean, steady relief of seeing a paper trail where Linda had counted on shadows. My local credit union was quiet in that Ohio way, all polished counters and soft carpet, the kind of place where people still said good morning like they meant it. I sat down with a folder so thick it felt like a second spine, and I asked for every change on the accounts tied to my name. The woman at the desk didn't judge me. She just started printing page after page, and the sound of that machine felt like a door locking behind me. Linda had been moving pieces around like I wouldn't notice, like memory was a fog she could walk me through. But memory is a bad witness when money is involved. Paper doesn't get confused, doesn't soften the truth, doesn't suddenly forget what happened. I saw the first line I hadn't authorized and felt my stomach go hard and cold. Then I saw the request to change access, then the attempt to redirect information, then the little neat signatures that weren't mine. It was all tucked inside a routine form, which somehow made it worse. She hadn't come in swinging, she'd come in smiling. That's what stung. People like to think betrayal always arrives loud, but sometimes it shows up in a ballpoint pen and a calm voice. I asked the teller to freeze what I could freeze, and I asked for copies of everything. Not someday, not later, right then. I learned a long time ago that when something feels off, you don't wait for your feelings to become a courtroom exhibit. Outside the sky was flat and gray, the kind of Midwest afternoon that makes everything look honest. I sat in my truck with the envelope on the seat beside me and read every page twice. Then I took photos, emailed them to myself, and made a backup at home. It felt almost paranoid until it felt smart. That's the lesson nobody tells you until you're already paying for the mistake. If a relationship turns hostile, your memory is not enough. Keep copies, keep timestamps, keep calm. Let the other person think you're still tired, still uncertain, still easy to manage. I wasn't going to confront Linda yet. I was going to let the facts sit in the sunlight first. When I got home, her purse was hanging by the door, like nothing in the world had changed. But I knew better now. And the next page in that folder had a name on it I had never seen before. The first thing I noticed when I walked into the courthouse was not the fluorescent lights or the hum of the ceiling vents. It was the silence behind me, steady and deliberate, like somebody had laid a clean sheet over a rattled table. I didn't have to turn around to know they were there. Marines don't enter a room like a parade. They settle into it like they've already measured the exits. One by one, old faces from Lejeune took the row behind me. A corpsman I hadn't seen in years, a sergeant who still stood a little straighter than everyone else, a friend who'd once shared his last coffee with me during a hurricane cleanup. No speeches, no grand announcements, just presence. I sat there with my hands folded and felt something in me unclench that I hadn't even realized was tight. For months I had been made to feel like a man who had outlived his usefulness, like my quiet meant weakness. But that row behind me carried a different kind of truth. They knew what I'd done when nobody was watching. They knew I was never the lazy story Linda had been telling. Their silence wasn't empty. It was a wall. I could feel people noticing, too. A few heads turned. A clerk paused a step too long. Linda's lawyer glanced over his shoulder like the temperature in the room had dropped. That's the thing about respect in a place like that. It doesn't need to announce itself. It just changes the air. I kept my eyes forward and breathed slow, letting myself borrow their steadiness. Sometimes the kindest thing another man can do is sit behind you and remind the room that you are not alone. Linda saw them when she came in. I watched the hesitation flicker across her face before she pasted on that careful expression she used when she wanted to look composed. But I knew her too well to miss the crack. She had expected a tired husband, maybe one lawyer, maybe pity. Instead, she walked into a room that had already stopped believing her version of me. I didn't look back again, because I didn't need to. I could feel the story shifting without a single word being spoken. Then Judge Morgan came in, took one look at the row behind me, and his expression changed in a way that made my chest tighten. He didn't smile. He didn't have to. He just set his files down slower than before, and I knew Linda felt it too. For the first time, her voice sounded small when she said my name. And I knew right then that the room no longer belonged to her story. The silence after her name was worse than any shouting. It spread across the courtroom like a cold draft under a locked door, and I could feel Linda trying to hold herself together by sheer pride alone. Her fingers kept smoothing the same edge of her blouse again and again, like if she could just make the wrinkle disappear, she could make the whole morning disappear with it. I sat there looking straight ahead, not because I was fearless, but because I had learned that sometimes the most powerful thing a man can do is stay still and let the truth keep walking toward the light. When her attorney tried to speak, Linda cut him off before he could even build momentum. That alone told me she was rattled. She had always loved being the one with the clean line, the polished answer, the version of events that sounded better if you didn't look too closely. But now the records were sitting in front of everyone like a stack of unpaid receipts, and every one of them had her fingerprints on it. Her mouth opened closed, then opened again. For a second, she looked less like the woman who had humiliated me, and more like somebody standing on the edge of a life she no longer recognized. I didn't want this, she said, and the room tightened around that one sentence. That was the first honest thing I had heard from her in a long time. Not kind, not forgiving, just honest. She stared at the table instead of at me, and her voice got thin when she kept going, saying she had spent years afraid of getting old, afraid of being stuck, afraid of ending up in a house full of silence and medical bills, and a husband she thought had already left her long before he ever walked out the door emotionally. I didn't interrupt. I could have. Part of me wanted to. But I knew enough about pain to recognize it when it was finally speaking without makeup on it. It didn't erase what she had done. It didn't soften the choices she made when I was already at my lowest. But for the first time, I saw that her cruelty had been carrying panic underneath it, like a polished floor hiding a rotten subfloor. She had been terrified of a future she didn't choose, and instead of telling me that she had tried to make me the problem. That realization landed hard because understanding her fear did not make my own humiliation any smaller. Her lawyer tried to recover the room with a quick hand on her sleeve and a sharp "Mrs. Hayes, please," but even he sounded like he knew the spell was broken. I stayed exactly where I was, hands folded, face calm, while Linda looked at me as if she was waiting for me to save her from what she had set in motion. I didn't move. I just watched her finally realize she was standing in the wreckage of her own story, and I wondered what she was going to do when she couldn't talk her way out of it anymore. The silence after that felt heavier than any argument, because now I wasn't waiting for Linda to talk her way out of it. I was reaching into the box we had built piece by piece, while everyone else had been busy mistaking her composure for truth. My attorney slid the first folder forward, and I could feel Linda go still beside her lawyer, the kind of stillness that tells you a person has just understood the floor is no longer steady under them. I started with the easiest thing to prove the sale of my Harley the old watch I'd worn through 2 deployments, the hunting rifle my father had given me. Not because those items mattered more than the marriage, but because each sale was a small private surrender I had made to keep the household afloat when my retirement checks weren't enough. Then came the pay stubs from the nights I worked security at the warehouse, folded and dated along with the bank deposits that matched them. No drama, no speeches, just paper numbers and the ugly honesty of a man who had been trying to carry too much alone. Morgan made it worse for her in the best possible way. because he didn't raise his voice or dress it up. He simply asked the clerk to mark each page into the record. The judge leaned forward as the timeline formed itself on the table. One quiet fact after another, like footprints in fresh snow that led straight to the same door. Linda kept blinking at the pages as if she could blink them into something softer, but the pages didn't care how polished she looked. Then my attorney laid out the letters. Not the sentimental kind Linda could dismiss as old memories, but the ones she had written when she thought I wasn't keeping them. One thanked me for making life possible. Another mentioned a transfer, a title change, and not telling him yet. That line sat in the air like a bad smell no one could pretend not to notice. I could feel the room shift, not because anyone had shouted, but because the story she had built was starting to collapse under its own weight. The last folder was the one that made Linda's face change. Credit union statements, excess changes, requests that didn't match the signatures she swore were never hers, a cashier's note, an account inquiry made at a time she had said she was at book club smiling over tea and lemon bars. I didn't look at her right away. I watched the judge instead because I needed to see the exact moment he stopped listening to either side and started seeing the pattern. And when he did, I knew the next question would not be about me at all. Her voice changed before her words did. That was the part that got me. Linda had spent months speaking about me like I was a broken chair she'd finally decided to put out at the curb, but when she stood there and looked at the judge, her shoulders folded in on themselves and the polish went out of her face. She said she had exaggerated things. She said I was never lazy. She said I had worked, carried, and kept going in ways she had chosen not to see, because it was easier to compare my life to the women from her book club than to sit with the truth of mine. I heard every word, and still I felt nothing like victory. It felt more like standing in a room after a storm and realizing the windows were still intact, but the air had changed forever. I kept my hands folded, because if I let them move, I was afraid they would show how hard my chest was tightening. She didn't say the parts that mattered most to me the first time, not really. She didn't say she had looked past my pain, because she was chasing a life that looked neat from the outside. She didn't say she had made my silence into a story about weakness because it helped her sleep at night. But she did say enough that the record could never pretend again. And there was something almost unbearable about that, because I had spent so long wanting her to understand me that hearing it in public felt less like relief and more like grief wearing a nicer coat. The judge let her finish. That silence was its own kind of judgment. I could see Linda swallowing hard, staring at the table like it might steady her if she just kept looking down. For 1 second, I saw the woman I married before the bitterness got comfortable in the house. Then the moment passed, and all I had left was the woman who had spent too many years asking for a version of me that no longer existed. I wanted to feel clean about it. I wanted to be the kind of man who could say, "There now, we're even." But life doesn't hand out neat endings when the damage ran this deep. When my attorney squeezed my arm under the table, I understood what he was really telling me. This was the point where the paperwork finally caught up to the pain. Linda had admitted enough. The records had already said the rest. I looked straight ahead and let the quiet settle over me. Like a coat, I was learning not to flinch inside. Whatever happened next would not erase what she had done, and it would not restore the years she spent looking away, but it would matter. The judge picked up the last page, and I knew the next words would decide the shape of the rest of my life. The first thing I noticed after the judge spoke was how loud my own breathing sounded in that room. Not because I was scared anymore, but because I had spent so many years holding myself tight that calm felt unfamiliar, almost suspicious. My retirement stayed where it belonged. The house got handled the way it should have from the start, and for once, I didn't have to sit there, watching someone else write my life like it was their property. I kept my eyes on the table and let the words settle in me slowly, the way rain sinks into dry ground. Linda didn't say much after that. Neither did I. There are moments when victory doesn't feel like a parade. It feels like setting down a heavy bag you forgot you were carrying and realizing your shoulders are still aching from the weight. I signed what needed signing, listened to what needed listening, and let my attorney do the talking. That was a change for me. I had spent too long trying to survive by swallowing everything. This time I let the paper speak. The small place I moved into near the lake wasn't impressive. That was the point. It had a one-car driveway, a narrow kitchen, and a porch that caught the morning light just right. The first night there, I sat in a folding chair with a cup of coffee and listened to nothing but the water moving in the distance. It didn't feel empty. It felt like my own mind finally had room to stretch. I had lived in a house that looked full while feeling alone in it for years, and the quiet by the lake was the first silence that didn't punish me. I started making different choices before I could talk myself out of them. I went to counseling on Tuesdays, even when I wanted to stay home and stare at the wall. I started showing up at the Veterans Center on weekday mornings, where the coffee was terrible, and the men understood more from a nod than most people understood from a speech. I learned how to eat breakfast without turning on the television, just to keep myself company. Little by little, I stopped mistaking noise for connection, and I got serious about boundaries. When someone called too late, I let it go to voicemail. When a conversation turned into guilt, I ended it politely and didn't reopen the door, just because they knocked harder. That was new for me. I used to think being a decent man meant absorbing everything. Now I know decent can still mean firm. It can mean protecting your peace, like it matters, because it does. Some mornings I still caught myself waiting for the old ache to return like weather rolling in over the lake. But it didn't own me anymore. I had a chair by the window, a routine that didn't lie to me, and a life that was smaller but true. I didn't get a fantasy. I got something better. I got my own name back, and I was just starting to understand what to do with it. The last paperwork was signed on a Tuesday that felt ordinary on purpose, and maybe that was the mercy in it. I sat there across from Linda and watched her finally understand that all the polished words in the world could not outrun a trail of bank records, letters, and dates that never changed their story. Her face had gone very still, like a house after the lights are cut. I didn't feel triumphant. I felt clear. That was more honest than revenge ever could have been. She had spent so long speaking over my silence that she never noticed I had started building a life where her version of me no longer fit. When the judge read the final order, Linda looked at the floor, then at me, and I saw something I had not seen in years, the absence of control. I didn't need to say, "I told you so." The truth had already done the talking, and that was enough. What hurt me most was realizing how long I had mistaken endurance for goodness. I thought if I stayed quiet, stayed useful, stayed easy to manage, I was being strong. All I really did was teach people what I would tolerate. That lesson cost me sleep peace and years I can't get back, but it also taught me something. I wish I had understood sooner. Respect is not something you beg for at the end of a long marriage. It is something you protect the moment it starts slipping. I still have quiet mornings by the lake, coffee cooling beside me, and I can hear my own thoughts now. They don't sound like apology anymore. They sound like a man who finally believes himself. I used to think appearances were everything in a family. Good church clothes, a clean kitchen, the right words in front of neighbors, the kind of smile that keeps the peace. But a shiny table can still hide a cracked leg. What mattered in the end was not how we looked to other people. It was who kept receipts, who kept promises, and who kept showing up when nobody was clapping. That is what saved me. Not pride, not luck. Just proof, boundaries, and the hard choice to stop letting someone rewrite my life while I stood there trying to be decent. If someone you loved spent years making you feel small, then suddenly you had the proof to show everyone the truth. Would you have stayed quiet like I did for so long, or would you have finally said enough?